Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Procedural Textures Gradient Blend. There are two general types of textures in Blender, procedural textures and image textures. A procedural texture is an internal mathematically generated texture. An image texture is an external image mapped to the faces of an object. Blender contains many types of procedural textures. Here we will examine the blend procedural texture. To demonstrate this, I have placed in my Blender scene a plane object to which I've linked a blue material. I've also placed there a tube, cube, and sphere objects. I'm using the default camera and the default lamp, but I've added a second hemi-lamp at a very low energy level to fill in some of the shadows. I've also split my 3D viewports so that the rendering will appear in the right window. I'll select the plane object and go to the Material Editor. As you can see, the plane has a blue diffuse color material which I have named Blue. I'll then click on the Texture Context icon, which will display the Texture Editor. If any textures already existed in my scene, I could link the blue material to the texture by using the ID Data drop-down box, which will list all of the textures currently in the scene. Now, as I have no existing textures, I'll click on the New button. By default, the type is set to Procedural Clouds texture. I'll click on the drop-down box and select the Blend Procedural texture. Now, there are many different ways that the blend procedural texture can be used. In this video tutorial, we will look at how it can be used to create a gradient diffuse color. Note in the blend panel that the default blend is linear horizontal blend as indicated by the preview. Instead of using the default black and white blend, I'll open up the color panel and checkmark the ramp checkbox. This displays an adjustable color band control in which we can create our own color gradients. This color band control is the same as the color band ramp control seen in an earlier tutorial. I'll click on the marker on the far left. This indicates that the color is black, with an alpha setting at 0, making it completely transparent. I'll click on the marker to the far right. This indicates that the color here is a light cyan or a blue-green, with an alpha setting at 1, making it completely opaque. I'll select the far left marker and set the color to a gold color. I'll set the alpha to 1, making it opaque. I'll then select the far right marker and set the color to a dark magenta, leaving the alpha set to 1. We now have a color band which ranges from magenta on the right to gold on the left. The interpolation is set to linear, so the colors blend from magenta to gold. Note that the color does not reach full gold except at the left end of the color band, and the color does not reach full magenta until the far right end of the color band. If we scroll down a bit, we can see that the default mapping coordinates for the texture are generated by Blender using a flat projection. This means that the texture will be projected flat across the mesh. Scrolling down further, we see that the default influence is set to the diffuse color of the object, which in this case is blue. When I render the scene, the magenta gold color gradient is mapped to the plane object, with the gradient running horizontally. I'll switch the blend to vertical and re-render. Here the gradient color is mapped to the plane object vertically. I'll select the right magenta marker and turn down the alpha to 0.4. I'll then re-render the scene. Now, since the alpha setting for the magenta color is only at 0.4, the underlying blue color shows through this part of the transparent gradient. I'll name this texture Magenta Gold. Now, if we take a look at the outliner panel, we see that the plane object has a mesh named Mesh, and that mesh has a material linked to it called Blue, and the blue material has a texture called Magenta Gold. I'll now select the sphere object and go to the material editor. The sphere does not have any material currently linked to it. I'll add a new material and name it red, green, blue. I'll then click on the Texture Context button and add a new texture. I'll select the Blend Procedural Texture, and I will name this texture Tricolor. I'll checkmark the Ramps checkbox and select the left marker and make it blue, and set the alpha to 1. I'll select the right marker and make it red, leaving the alpha set to 1. So far we've only been using 2 colors on the color band. It's possible to add additional markers by either clicking on the Add button or Control left clicking on the color band itself. Here I will add a marker in the center of the color band. The swatch color automatically takes on the color and the alpha setting currently at that point in the color band. To select a marker, just select it by either left-clicking it or using the select indicator at the top. To delete a marker, select it and click the Delete button. I'll add a marker in the center of the color band and make it green with the alpha set to full. We now have a gradient running from blue to green to red. I'll set the blend setting to linear and vertical, and I'll then re-render the scene. The sphere now has a vertical tricolor gradient. If we look at the outliner panel, we can see that the material named red, green, blue linked to the sphere's mesh, and the tricolor texture linked to the material. There are a number of different progressions available when using the blend texture. I'll change the linear progression to a quadratic progression and render the scene. The quadratic progression uses a quadratic equation to determine the transition from one color to the other. It starts off with a very large allocation for the first color marker, and then it gets progressively smaller. I'll change the progression to easing and render the scene. Here the transition between colors is eased or smoothed to a greater extent than the default linear progression. Now I'll select the plane object, and I'll change the progression of the magenta gold blend from linear to diagonal, and then render the scene. Here the progression is diagonal from one corner to the opposite corner. Now I chose the plane as the diagonal progression is more obvious with a flat projection than it is with a spherical projection. I'll change the progression on the plane from diagonal to spherical and render the scene. Now I'll change the progression to quadratic sphere and render the scene. And finally, I'll change it to radial and render the scene. I'll now select the tube object and add a new material to it. I'll name this material Tube Ramp. I'll go to the texture editor and add the existing tricolor texture to the tube ramp material. Note that the number 2 indicates that this texture is now being used by 2 materials. In this case, the red, green, blue material linked to the sphere, and the tube ramp material linked to the tube. We can see this in the outliner editor. I'll click on the number 2 next to the tricolor name, which makes it independent of the original tricolor texture, and it changes the name of the texture to tricolor.001. I can now make changes in the texture editor without affecting the tricolor texture currently linked to the sphere mesh material. I'll set the blend to linear and vertical, and the mapping to tube, and then I'll render the scene. The tube now has a vertical tricolor gradient. If we scroll down to the color band, we see that the color band itself has interpolation settings, with the default being linear. I will change the interpolation to constant. Here the colors do not blend into one another. The color is blue at the left until it meets the next marker where it changes to green, and it remains green until it meets the next marker on the far right, which is red, although we can't see it. I'll move the green and blue markers so that we get a more even distribution, and then I'll render the scene. I'll change the interpolation to B-spline, which creates very soft edges, and I'll re-render it. Here I will change the blend setting from vertical to horizontal on the tricolor.001 texture, and then render the scene. Note here that the effect is not as expected. The tube does not have horizontal bands of color. Now, to get horizontal effect on the tube, I need to go to the mapping panel and switch the X and Z mapping. Here I will use Z for the X mapping, and here use X for the Z mapping. Now when I re-render the scene, the tricolor gradient is displayed horizontally. I'll select the cube object and add a material to it and name it Cube Ramp. I'll add a new blend texture and name it Pink Ramp. I'll check mark Ramp and set the left marker to dark red, and the alpha to full. I'll set the right marker to pink. We now have a pink to dark red gradient. I'll set the blend to vertical and linear, and change the projection to cube, and render the scene. The cube now has a pink to dark red vertical gradient. If I change the blend to horizontal and re-render it, I get a different pink to dark red gradient, but it's not horizontal. To get the horizontal effect on the cube, I again need to go to the mapping panel and switch the X and Z mapping. Here I will use Z for the X mapping and use X for the Z mapping. Now when I re-render the scene, the gradient is displayed horizontally.